My name is Annie Madden. I do a bit of stuff for INPUD in this region and internationally at times, just representational work. I'm also involved because I live in Sydney in New South Wales with the New South Wales Users and AIDS Association, or NUA. I used to be involved with the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League, or better known as AVIL, for 16 years until 2016.
My name is Charles Henderson. Currently I'm working for the New South Wales Users and AIDS Association, known as NUA, in New South Wales, Australia. But previously I spent most of my career in New Zealand working within the Needle Exchange Program.
My name's Jude Byrne. I'm with the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League, and I've been with them for the last 30 years or more.
My name is Jeff Ward. I was born in America, grown up in Melbourne, live in Canberra now. I work for a peer-based drug use organisation in Canberra called CAHMA, Canberra Alliance for Harm Minimisation and Advocacy. It's Canberra's peer-based drug use organisation, and I'm the policy advocacy and peer support worker.
I used drugs in many different ways over the years, amphetamines, psychedelics and other psychostimulants and psychoactives, but I think I would say opiates are my main drug of choice, and have a long injecting drug use career, and I've also been on methadone for over 20 years now. When
I was 16, I read a book called Panic in Needle Park, and this is back in 1975, so drug use wasn't, highly infiltrated into the mainstream community, so I had to go looking for it, and it took me 18 months to find it, because I really liked the way that people lived their lives, the tension, the excitement that they really seemed to be living, and it just something about it attracted me, so I went looking for it, and then when I found it, it was just worked beautifully. I really liked it. It made me feel the way I want to feel if I have to get through this world. And once you found that, it's hard not to pursue it. And I don't believe it's anybody else's business what my body needs to live and function and work well.
As a teenager, typical Australian male, started out with alcohol, which I suppose is the rite of passage for most people in Australia. But as soon as I found hash and started eating hash and having it with edibles, that was the end of my interest in alcohol. From there, when I moved out of home, started smoking cannabis, using a bit of speed, and then after a car accident, I went through a car windscreen and had bits of glass in my face, and a friend of mine introduced me to heroin, and once I had discovered the joys of heroin, that was it. I was off to the races, and used for probably 15 years. And at that stage, I think we were very fortunate in Australia that we were located where we had access to the Golden Triangle, which was high quality white powder, alkaline powder, and a variety of rocks, pink, beige, etc. So there was a lot of variety of very high quality heroin, and it was sort of affordable, and it was much more of a social situation. I found it a very mind expanding, met lots of interesting people. It just opened my eyes to a whole different world. I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for my heroin use, and I just couldn't make the next step to turn to crime to continue. So I actually then went on methadone. I've been on methadone in both Victoria and the Australian Capital Territory for probably 30 years now, and I would give that significant credit for still being here.
I started using very early. And I was very perturbed to see in my attempts to get a needle and syringe that there was a police car, just 50 yards away from the entrance of where I was going to get a needle and syringe. And I just thought, that was kind of weird, even though there was a lot of talk around trying to make sure that people would get a new needle and syringe. So I kind of sort of very much wondered about why there would be such a sort of dichotomy. I guess from that point on, I always felt, well, I could represent drug users because I am part of that community.
The history of the drug users' rights movement in Australia is a long and rich one, actually. So that's a nice thing to be able to say. We've probably one of the few countries that have had a funded and ongoing drug users movement and presence in Australia for over 30 years now. So the organisations generally sort of grew up out of that grassroots kind of level, very much grassroots activism in the kind of mid to late 80s, largely in response to HIV/AIDS when that first came onto our agendas.
Drug users really early on understood that there was a virus going around that had something to do with some needles, and they were setting up underground needle exchanges. They were making sure they told each other about sharing.
Fortunately, at that stage, the Hawke Labor government had a very progressively minded health minister in Dr. Neil Blewett, who took the, I think, enlightened view of the best response to dealing with the crisis was to talk to affected communities, which was gay men, sex workers and intravenous drug users, and involve them in crafting the public education messages and involving those communities in how to best respond to HIV. And of course, with injecting drug users, access to clean injecting equipment was a massive issue because there wasn't a needle and syringe program.
You can put all the funding you like in, but you need to have the right people in the right place who have reach into communities and who have credibility and are relatable for those communities for that to really work. And we were there on the ground, demanding peer-based services and peer-based needle and syringe programs because we knew that that is what was going to work the best with our community because they're highly marginalised, highly stigmatised and would be reluctant to come forward.
I got hepatitis B 3 times before I worked out that sharing injecting equipment was most likely the cause of me continually getting sick. And fortunately I found a surgical supply shop that sold glass syringes with metal picks that were known as Luolock, and I never let anyone use my glass fit, and I would boil it for 10 or 11 minutes after using and never got Hep B again, and fortunately avoided HIV and Hep C as well. But really the beginning of the response and the formation of ABLE as the peak drug use organisation was all in response to HIV/AIDS. It was not about any compassion for drug users or concern for their lives or keeping them alive. It was purely how do we stop HIV getting into the mainstream community? And it was successful.
We've never had an openly drug-using apparatus or organisation in New Zealand, but the Needle Exchange Program has been a de facto organisation or apparatus for drug user rights. In New Zealand, early 1980s, there was the coming together of drug users to think about ways where they will be able to look after themselves and drug user rights, but it was very much aligned towards injecting drug use and the HIV epidemic. New Zealand might be one of the first countries in the world to have a national needle exchange program. And what I mean by that is needle exchange is offered and sterile needles and syringes offered right across the country. And getting that done, there were some early activists that worked very hard, and I think in particular of a HIV gay drug user. He was actually sending needles and syringes to the Minister of Health. He managed to get the Minister of Health to very much be much more aware of the issues around HIV. As a national manager of that needle exchange program, I was able to work very hard to get some legislative change around the possession of needles and syringes. Even though there was a needle exchange program, it was still illegal to carry needles and syringes. I was able to build up a body of evidence around getting the government to understand that they needed to change that law, and we were successful. We've got one of the lowest HIV rates in the world amongst people who inject drugs. So that's an outstanding success. And that's a success because we introduced needle exchange program early.
The eventually we established a national organisation in Able, and that sort of once again grew out of the grassroots movement, and the kind of state and territory or provincial type organisations eventually established a national organisation to create a voice at that federal level as well. So it's a very rich history. It is a history that involves government funding of organisations, and therefore both professional, paid and volunteer activists and workers. So lots of programs and services, as well as activism and campaigns.
We developed the first peer naloxone program ever in Australia, and it sort of had a sort of serendipitous history. I went to the 2010 International Harm Reduction Conference in Liverpool in the UK, and I went to a presentation by a doctor from the United States, Dr. Sars Maxwell, who spoke about street training of heroin users in how to recognise an opiate overdose and respond with naloxone. And at the end of the presentation, I actually went to say, you know, that's really inspiring stuff. I'm so impressed with what you're doing. And she said, well, you know, what are you doing in Australia? And I said, well, really nothing. You have to call an ambulance or get to emergency department of a hospital. And she sort of almost maybe put my hand on my heart and promised to do whatever I could when I got back to Canberra to try and get a peer project up and running. And the proposal that I wrote was very basic, to have a trial of naloxone in Canberra, got a tick, and CARMA was funded to do a trial of naloxone with 200 current heroin users in Canberra, and it evaluated so well that we got actually new funding, and we have a permanent full-time worker, Dave, who does naloxone training of users, family and friends, and also workers, and we've saved, you know, you can't put the exact number, but dozens, if not hundreds of lives through that project. So I'm very proud of that.
When the HIV virus had been sort of, epidemic had been sort of, you know, put to bed, and our numbers were staying under, you know, 2%. But Hep C, which had been tracking along all the time behind it, drug users had been getting Hep C forever. We hung around for those years in between HIV and Hep C and tried to lobby really hard to get the government to see that they couldn't do Hep C without us either. I think we've made a huge difference into the number of drug users who have Hep C, who are going to treatment. And I think having us at the table has made them think and move a little further than they would have if we hadn't been at the table. And it's hard being at that table because quite often you're the only drug user in a table of 20 or 30 bureaucrats, researchers, senior politicians. And it can be, you know, it can be really difficult to get your point across. And sometimes I just say to, you know, younger people, sometimes you don't have to say anything, you just have to be there, because by being there, they're thinking about you and they're not going as hard as they would have.
One of the big impacts that my activism has had on me was when I stood up in the 1999 New South Wales Drug Summit here in Sydney. This was held in Parliament House in Sydney. The room was filled with politicians, of course, because we're in Parliament House, and invited guests from the broader community and the sector. And I stood up forgetting, strangely and stupidly, I guess, that there was media in Parliament House. It didn't really occur to me for some reason, but I stood up and declared that I was an injecting drug user on the floor of the Parliament. And it caused quite a stir, I have to say. But I did that because the conversations that were going on at the Drug Summit were very stigmatising towards drug users. I was very concerned about what they were talking about and the types of initiatives that they were looking at, either bringing in or ending. So, for example, there were discussions about ending methadone programs because they just encourage drug use and that sort of thing. So I was really worried about that. I was working for Newer at the time, and I decided that I was going to stand up and make an intervention. As I say, it had a huge impact. Media were there in Parliament House, and I ended up being rushed into a media conference straight after making the intervention, which ended up being on the national news that night, on television, on radio, in newspapers. I was, personally attacked quite profoundly by some of the right-wing radio shock jocks and right-wing commentators in the newspaper. But most importantly, it meant that my family saw all of this for them in quite a shocking way, I guess, and came out of the blue. So it meant that I was estranged from my family for probably 10 years after that. They found it difficult to understand what my life was about and this aspect of me, I guess. And I also know when I look back on it now that, you know, they were feeling stigmatised and shamed as well. As I've got older, I've reflected on just, you know, that stuff's really hard, I think. And often, while we bear the brunt, of course, of the stigma and discrimination that drug users face, our families and friends, I think, also bear some of that stigma. Stigma's really sticky, you know. I'm happy to say we did reconcile those things over time, and in fact our relationship is much better and far more honest. In fact, one of the outcomes from the 1999 New South Wales Drug Summit was that the government decided to establish Australia's first medically supervised injecting room, and it is on the record that it was the activism of myself and other drug user activists at the time coming out publicly and passionately on that issue that actually was quite a turning point in that decision. And equally, the more recent decision on the Melbourne medically supervised injecting facility, the drug user activists in Australia and Victoria were very, very much front and centre on getting that decision through as well.
Well, you can tell by the way I use my walk, I'm a woman's man, no time to talk. Music loud, women walk, I've been kicked around since I was born. Never tolerate, that's okay, and you may look the other way, but we can try to understand and do your time to make no man. Whether you're a brother or whether you're a mother, you're staying alive, staying alive. Feel the city breaking and everybody shaking, and we're staying alive, staying alive. Staying alive, staying alive. Staying alive.
You know, like once you're added as a drug user in the public service, your career's going nowhere. It cost me another job in the community sector when I got outed as a heroin user. You know, I did suffer some personal impact from the fact that my choice of drug happened to be something that was deemed illicit and therefore frowned upon by employers and many other just general people who dumped me as a friend when they found out that I was a heroin user.
People are frightened of us. That's the thing that I think bothers me the most is when you ask, because we're othered so successfully, they think they don't even know what we do and who we are. I mean, I think they probably think we go to the toilet standing on our heads and we only eat vegetables that have been, you know, mixed up with green herbs. Because when they write research papers about us and when they're talking about how we'd respond to something, it seems to be that it wouldn't be the response of the usual human being, it'll have to be the response of this group of people, and they're not the same. And then they get to know one of you and they think that you're the exception, and it doesn't change their mind about the other ones. People have these crazy ideas about what drug users look like, and we look like everybody. You know, there's nothing that we look like. But there's more of us in the workforce, and there's more of us who are living next to you than you'll ever see in the streets around your city, homeless and struggling. There's many, many more of us. But, you know, we have to pass because the outcomes are too difficult. If I hadn't have got into the movement, I don't think I would have shrugged off the internal stigma and the shame and all the other things that, you know, I'd been sort of secretly, you know, harbouring for years, because you can't help but be affected by the way people perceive you and, you know, the actions that people do when they're around you once they know you're a drug user. It's made me a fighter, and I don't know that I would have been a fighter if I hadn't come across this issue.
That relentless propaganda, drugs are bad, junkies are evil, you know, it permeates the consciousness of the society. It makes it very, very difficult. The mainstream media, especially News Corporation and the Murdoch empire, never print positive stories about drug users or drug use in general. It's always negative stuff, you know, headlines, you know, people robbing little old ladies, or, you know, just calamitous headlines, and often it's misinformation.
Being a drug user put myself and exposed me to some repercussions that were pretty fundamental and pretty life-changing, and that's related to criminalisation. But in terms of my personal life, it was nothing but wonderful. I think it extended my my vision, it extended my thinking. Being a drug user exposed me to communities that I wouldn't have been exposed to if I hadn't used drugs.
While I'm a drug user, I'm also many other things in my life, and I've also run organisations, and I'm currently a PhD student, and I've been to university, and I've been a student activist, and I've done lots of things in my life, and so it's one part of my life. But what I have found is that because of the way that drugs are perceived and portrayed in society, often it becomes all you are once you're public about that. And I have been the victim of some quite really harsh media coverage over the years. There was one double-page spread that was dedicated to me where I had dared publicly to stand up and declare myself an injecting drug user, and to say not only that, but that I was okay, thanks very much, and that I also was a productive member of the community, and that I had good relationships with friends and family, and was, a functioning person in the community. And because I dared to say all of those things and to contradict the stereotypes, my punishment was a double-page spread of me in a major metropolitan newspaper with a caricature of me looking very haggard and tired, with a fit hanging out of my arm, looking in the mirror with the headline, "You're kidding yourself, Annie." So I don't know, that was hard to see those things. But interestingly, there were also articles from other perspectives that were really supportive and really encouraging. And one of the things I remember most from that time is that I got dozens and dozens, literally, of letters and emails from other drug users who said to me, "Thank you so much for doing this." I could tell the heartfelt gratitude from some of the people writing to me, to just say, "I don't feel so alone in the world now, and thank you for doing that." So the rewards are really rich, but the criticisms and the spotlights can be harsh too.
We've had successes, but it's almost to me like putting band-aids on a severed artery. It's not actually addressing the fundamental cause of the harms which are due to prohibition and the war on people who use drugs. Like methadone program, buprenorphine, great. I mean, personally, it's been wonderful for me, but I'd prefer pharmaceutical grade heroin if I could. Harm reduction, which gets, I think, less than 2% of the overall funding expenditure. Most of it goes to police, customs, courts, jails, etc. Very little funding comes from government to actually address the harms of prohibition. They like prohibition. They support prohibition. It's just say no. It's war on drugs. It's, and despite the failure, wasn't the famous definition of insanity is to keep repeating the same thing, expecting a different result? Well, that's what we're doing.
When you read the litany of horrors and catastrophes and human rights abuses and criminal justice corruption that falls out of prohibition, you have to do something about it, or you're not being a good member of your community.
Something to me which is your personal choice to put a substance into your body and you're not hurting anyone else, you're not allowed to do that. The state or the government has a list which is, to me, very arbitrary. I mean, the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the UN Convention, goes back to 1961. It's not based on any real evidence. To me, it's a political and it's a construct that serves a couple of purposes. I think it makes a hell of a lot of money that is factored into the global economic order. You've got banks like HSBC convicted of laundering cartel cocaine profits. Did anyone go to jail? No. It's a cover for CIA and other spy agencies to meddle in the affairs of other countries, and they can say, "Oh, we're not engineering a coup in a leftist South American government, we're fighting the war on drugs. So it provides that sort of cover. So I think there's a lot of dishonesty in what actually is going on. You know, this is not a positive global social policy. In fact, I would say it is the single most catastrophic global public policy fiasco, disaster that's cost more lives, shortened lives, wreaked more harm, extrajudicial killings, beheadings, discrimination, stigma, jailing. And one of the saddest things is the internalising of the oppression that a lot of drug users feel, that they're not worthy of being given good service or good health care or being not discriminated against, because they read so often about how filthy they are as junkies and lowlives, and that they end up taking that on internally. And I find that really, really sad.
For me, one of the most important goals of the drug users movement should be the reform of the current drug control regime, from the international level through to sort of national or domestic levels and local levels, top to bottom, across the board. I think it is a rotten, sick and very punitive and harmful approach to addressing the issue of drug use in society.
I would like to see Australia withdraw from the 3 United Nations conventions and act on behalf of Australian citizens on the merits of the issue. I see no benefit to Australia. We waste millions, if not billions of dollars enforcing these UN conventions. Why? Why are we doing that to our own citizens? We don't have a situation like in the Philippines where people are extrajudicially murdered in the street or beheaded like in Saudi Arabia, but there are still many people whose lives have been cut short through overdose, bloodborne viruses that weren't or couldn't be treated, incarceration, lost opportunities, inability to travel, mothers have had their children taken from them because, care and protection see a drug-using mother as intrinsically a bad mother without any analysis of her individual circumstances or how well she's looking after children. The perception is bad mother instantly. So there's a whole slew of negative impacts that prohibition has had, tangibly negative impact on the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in this country, and continues to do so. I mean, the drug driving laws are costing people their licences day in, day out. And after I've had clients come in and say, I smoked a joint 3 days ago. I got, pulled over on the road and it came up positive for cannabis. I went to court, I was found guilty, and I've lost my licence for 12 months. I mean, that's just bad law. That's just unfair. That's not justice. New South Wales is really heavy-handed. You've got young girls being strip searched by police, people going to music festivals running a phalanx of sniffer dogs and not being able to go to the festival if they're deemed to have an ecstasy tablet. And a lot of the overdoses are due to people seeing that phalanx of police and sniffer dogs and throwing down their day's supply that they were going to take over the whole period of the festival in one go, and ending up having adverse reactions. And we had 6 deaths of young Australians in the last summer music festival. And to me, that's blood on the hands of our politicians for ignoring the evidence and insisting on just more prohibition.
We have had some interesting civil disobedience type activism that we've been doing recently on pill testing, trying to pilot pill testing in music festival environments, despite that not being legal in Australia at the moment. We have had real success in preventing new HIV infections and keeping the epidemic under control in Australia among people who inject drugs. But we have also lost a lot of people early to the HIV epidemic, and it's a story that's sometimes forgotten and not told. Like all of our community across the world, in different countries and places, we've all lost lots of people along the way. Some people that come to mind for me, recently we lost Jenny Kelsall, who was the Chief Executive Officer of Harm Reduction Victoria, previously known as VivAIDS, in Melbourne, Australia. And Jenny was a tireless, amazing drug user activist. She has been with the movement in Australia since very early days.
The very existence of our organisations gives heart and hope to many drug users. We can be visible and vocal in a way that individual drug users can't be. Unfortunately, some of the research in this country indicates that the bulk of stigma and discrimination occurs within health settings. The people who should and do know better are so often the people who are perpetuating these negative attitudes and negative stereotypes and treating people in a far from optimal manner. I've been injecting now for more than 20 years. I'm a grandmother now, but I am very grateful for OST. I'm on a methadone program. Heroin's the only drug I personally have ever been particularly interested in, and I imagine that it will remain part of my life until the day I die.
Sadly, Jenny died from liver cancer associated with hepatitis C infection. And for me, Jenny's death just really sort of highlights the injustice and how wrong all of this is, that people are dying from entirely preventable infections and disease consequences. It doesn't need to be happening, but it happens repeatedly to our people in our community because of stigma and discrimination and fear of coming forward. But I think if I'm thinking about the things that, really work and that I've seen really have impact, it's when we speak from the heart. It's when we speak about our lives and our experiences in the way that, this stuff affects our lives so deeply, It's even hard to think about it, but it's those raw moments when we try to get across just, how much suffering people around the world, drug users around the world. This very day while we're sitting here, people locked in prisons in horrific environments and acquiring entirely preventable diseases and dying of overdoses at incredible rates and those sorts of things. I think it's when we talk about that stuff honestly and frankly. I do think that when you can kind of couple that with, the research evidence and the facts and all of that, it just makes it so, all the more powerful. But I think our real strength is in our stories and in our experiences and making people listen to that and saying you can't turn away. I won't let you turn away because this is hard. You're going to listen to me because this is important. It's about people's lives.
Mentoring, advocating and educating people that they aren't bad people, that this isn't deviant behaviour, they're not criminal lowlifes, that it's part of the normal human condition to take drugs for a whole range of reasons. People take drugs for all sorts of reasons. I took it because I was young and wanted to experiment and I was enjoying life as a young person in St Kilda in Melbourne, and these drugs happened to come across my path and I had a great time. And people take drugs for all sorts of reasons, for pleasure, for fun, socialising with their peers. A lot of people take drugs to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, being sexually abused as a child, all sorts of horrible childhood experiences. Taking heroin is a psychic and a physical pain relief that is perfectly normal if you've been a subject of incest growing up or abused in foster home to foster home. Like some of the stories, there are many people who turn to taking drugs and become dependent on drugs for perfectly understandable reasons that, all you can do is empathise and congratulate the heroism of their survival, really.
The legal framework and the regulation of illicit drugs and being brought into a societal acceptance is exactly what needs to happen. It means all those other health, social and economic determinants will follow, and that will see such a greater reduction in all of those overall harms that are born in the first instance from the fact that they've made these drugs illegal.
The only way to earn your human rights to put inside your body what you want without the state telling you what you can and can't do and putting you in jail if you fall foul of it is to fight for change.
No, just that I'm really proud of us. You know, I think we've done amazingly well. And when I look at Africa and what's happening for injecting drug users in Africa from the general community and the Philippines, my God, America, Russia. When I look at those people who are just being traumatised and brutalised beyond belief, and they're still standing up fighting, and I think that's mighty, and I'm really proud of them all.